So we just heard the Borromeo Quartet play this tiny little section that we call transition, whose function is to take us away from the trio with its wonderful loud finale and bring us back to the soft, bustling energy of the scherzo before it returns. Nick, there is something very interesting that is happening in this transition, and that is that the wonderful climactic scale that was marked with FFMO before starts to get slowed down, right?
Mm-hmm. So we have the one that is
and there's something wonderful that is happening here. To augment the effect of the slowing down, you see that Beethoven writes longer note values, but he also augments that by writing ritardando, which is a slowing down, right? And there is something wonderfully kinetic about this that, can we maybe hear one more time the scale as it slows down and it reaches this high do? And there's something wonderfully kinetic about that. The music is suspending on this high do, and it seems that gravity is pulling it towards. And here we see two notes that remind us of the original figure from this. Yeah. What I find very interesting from a compositional perspective is that when Beethoven is composing the theme of the scherzo, the theme of the trio, he seems very sure about what he's doing. There's very little edits. But when he's writing transitional movements, there's a whole bunch of editing process. In the section that we heard before, you see like things scratched out, blurry things, things that he recomposed, and nowhere are those more vivid than in this tiny, 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 tiny transition section. So we see a scratch mark here that could be something like a time signature, no? Right. Indeed, there's a time signature change here. We're changing from 6/4, which is 2 beats per bar, each beat subdivided in 3 parts. So it feels yapapa, 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 to cut time, which is again 2 beats per bar, equal beats to the previous beats, but every beat is subdivided in 2. So yampa, yampa, yappa, yappa. And in a way, it is this factor that makes these notes feel heavier. But what I love of all the edits that we see here is this tiny little thing. You see that Beethoven must have added a bar of silence here. If you compare graphologically the amount of space that this bar occupies and the amount of space that this occupies, they're about equal, which makes sense because if we time them, we see that they are supposed to last exactly the same thing. And then Beethoven realizes that he needs an extra bar of silence. So he very sloppily puts it in right here. Here a little bit less sloppily so, probably because he decided it is a good idea after all to add this bar. And in a moment of inspiration, he writes very fastly the rests here, but he doesn't think it's necessary to write the rest in the lower 2 instruments. I love this because silence is such an expressive component in late Beethoven. And I interpret the compositional need to insert silence there on 2 levels. One is the amount of contrast between the 2 materials, the kind of very light descending figure and this very articulated, little 2-note figure that foreshadows the return to the previous material. Another thing that I think makes the silence work so well is that silences tend to inundate Beethoven's music in transitional moments. He's trying to foreshadow something that's going to happen, but he inserts a silence there to engage memory, to allow things to be recalled, and also to create a moment of disorientation. A wonderful example is in the Fifth Symphony, in the first movement, before the first theme returns. It's so permeated by silences. As a matter of fact, I remember the German theorist Adorno said that the silences in Beethoven is where the emptiness of the music turns outward, when it becomes inexorably a part of the emotional language of the piece. And you see that this essentially is an afterthought in the composer. I think this is information that you see only if you study the manuscript. You know, it seems so well placed, and yet you see that this is a decision of the last moment. And I also love very much this idea that the composer has a dialectic relationship with his or her material all the way up to the finished stage. We haven't mentioned this, but you know, looking at this manuscript, we're not looking at early sketches, we're not looking at like day one of the composition of this. We're looking at the thing that's about to go to the publisher. So it's fairly late in the creative process, as a matter of fact, as late as it can be. Right. And yet still the composer has a live dialogue with the material. And I think that's such a powerful message for composers today, this very living engagement and dialogue that you have with your own material.
And I think what you're pointing out here, where in a sense we take what would have been a certain amount of silence and triple it, or nearly anyway, we greatly increase it. If you remember, there was such a buildup to have an enormous amount of sound. And here we get the absolute opposite, where it goes to silence, and the importance of the shock that the listener will feel, and the need to almost fill in that silence brings up their expectation for what's going to happen next.